John Alden returns to Salem after being away for 7 years and is surprised at how much the town has changed. Fear of witches has spread throughout the community, and his sweetheart, Mary Walcott, is married to the town's most influential and wealthy selectman, George Sibley. In 1685, in the town of Salem, the residents gather at the square to witness the public trial of Isaac Walton and his girlfriend Abigail Cook, who were both locked in a pillory. After Isaac admits committing the sin of self-pollution, George Sibley, the head selectman, orders his follower to mercilessly whip the young man 10 times. Convinced the lashing isn't enough, the selectman takes a hot iron and scorches an F into Isaac's forehead, for him to bear a permanent mark of his sin. John Alden, a brave young man, implicitly criticizes George's morality for enabling unjust punishments by quoting the Bible. This provokes George, who replies that he only respects John because of his father's memory, and that it can only shield him from repercussions for so long. When a furious John attempts to comfort the selectman, Giles Corey stops him. Later that night, lovers Mary Alcott and John Alden secretly meet at the graveyard. John tells Mary that he has to leave to fight the French and Indians. Upon noticing Mary's worried expression, he reassures her that he will return to her soon. Out of his pocket, he pulls a silver coin and breaks it in two. He hands her one half and promises that the war won't last a year. Months after John leaves her war, Mary has morning sickness, but keeps her pregnancy a secret. That night, Tituba takes Mary to the woods to get rid of the child she is carrying. At first, Mary agrees to her friend's plan, but as they go deeper into the forest, she grows more hesitant. To convince Mary to push through, Tituba tells the pregnant woman that the baby has no place in Salem and warns her of what George Sibley might do if he finds out she's pregnant out of wedlock. During the dark ritual, Mary has a terrifying vision in which John transforms into a black human-animal hybrid creature and begins chasing her. She puts her hand to her stomach soon after the ritual is done and weeps when she realizes that her child is no longer there. As she grieves, Tituba reassures her that the world will be hers after offering her child's life. 7 years later, John returns to Salem. Before entering town, he sees 3 people hanging from a tree. As he walks through the village, he sees a sign warning the town about witches. Isaac sees the weathered soldier, but John doesn't notice him. As John walks through the commons, he notices Reverend Cotton Mather speaking to a crowd. He then heads to his family's home where his trusted friend, Giles, points a shotgun at him, but the older man lowers the gun when he realizes who it is. Giles is surprised to see John alive, especially after hearing he had perished years ago. While speaking with Giles, John finds out that Salem is caught up in a so-called witch panic, led by Cotton. He also finds out that Mary is no longer a Walcott, but a Sibley. She became the richest woman in town upon marrying Sibley after his first wife passed away. In the Sibley residence, Isaac comes in with Mary's packages and informs her that he saw John back in town. In quiet shock, Mary accidentally pricks her finger with a needle upon hearing the news. Meanwhile, Reverend Cotton enters a pub and promises to pay 3 male volunteers to help him subdue a girl. John volunteers and the group heads to the home of Reverend Lewis. His daughter, Mercy, who is thought to be under the influence of a witch, is acting wildly and needs to be pinned down so that she doesn't hurt anyone else or herself any further. After tying Mercy up, Cotton asks her if she knows who is tormenting her. She points at the door and claims the old woman is to blame, but only she can see the hag. After the Reverend puts her to sleep, he tells John that Mercy suffered a spectral attack at the hands of witches. John Alden doesn't believe in witches and thinks Mercy is simply ill and needs to see a doctor. When the men leave, the hag steps out of the shadows and attacks the screaming girl. The following day, Magistrate Hale's daughter, Anne, and his wife, Mrs. Hale, are on their way to the church hall when they run into Mary. Inside the hall, the crowd listens to Cotton, who warns that the town is still plagued by witches, despite catching and disposing of 3. He explains that the threat continues to exist because there are still witches living among them, and the paranoid Reverend suggests they might even be inside the hall right now. Hale stands and asks Cotton how he plans to identify the culprits. The Reverend tells him that Mercy, who is being manipulated by a witch, can help identify them. The magistrate thinks it's a bad idea, and Mary concurs by saying a witch hunt is far worse than a witch. Suddenly, John Alden speaks up and mocks the existence of witches. Mary is surprised to see her former lover for the first time in years. She welcomes him back and later invites him to a small dinner with her husband at their home the next day. Later, in the pub, John plays with his half-silver coin when he notices a man staring at him. He confronts the man and points a gun under the table, only to find out that it's Isaac, the disgraced man from 7 years ago. Isaac tells John that witches are real and advises him not to abandon Salem again. Meanwhile, Cotton is at Reverend Lewis's home. and carefully searches Mercy's body for a mark where she might have suckled a witch's familiar. While doing so, he finds himself aroused when laying his hand upon the girl's body. Immediately after, the Reverend makes love to the courtesan Gloriana. Later, John Alden speaks to Cotton and learns that the Reverend relies on books to provide him with the information he needs for his witch hunt. Though he finds this strange, he proceeds to ask him about the witch's desire, to which the Reverend responds that they seek a country of their own. In the Sibley residence, Mary presses George's stomach and pulls the frog out of his mouth. Without the animal in his body, the select man is able to speak, implying that Mary has been using dark magic to subdue her husband. She then positions the frog to suckle from her thigh before aggressively pushing the frog back into George's mouth. Helpless in his chair, the man is forced to listen to Mary's threats of revenge because she believes he took everything from her. At the dinner party, John and the other guests congregate at the Sibley home. While Magistrate Hale and his wife try to set up their daughter with Cotton, Anne's attention is fixed on the wary soldier. When the discussion starts to revolve around witches, John suddenly sees Anne and then Mary under the table, in between his legs, an illusion created by Mary herself. Disturbed by the sight, John goes outside to get some fresh air and Mary soon follows him. As they catch up on each other's lives, Mary finally learns the truth that John was held captive by the Indians for a long time, rendering him unable to send her any letters. In an attempt to rekindle the relationship, John takes out the silver coin that represents his vow and asks Mary to run away to New York with him. However, Mary turns down the proposal, claiming that George won't ever let her leave. After the dinner party, Mary angrily confronts Tituba for making her believe that John was dead. As she weeps, Tituba tells her that John doesn't deserve her tears and that she belongs to someone else now. Indignant Mary shrieks so loudly that the mirror in front of her shatters. Tituba comforts her, telling her the sacrifices have made her a rich and powerful woman. Hours later, Giles pays Mary a visit and admits to seeing her and Tituba in the woods years ago to get rid of John's baby. He believes John has a right to know, causing Mary to feel threatened and compelled to devise a plan. The following morning, John leaves the town and heads for New York. Along the way, he encounters Anne, who is passionately sketching in a graveyard. When John leaves, she runs into Mary, who secretly takes strands off her hair. Later that day, Cotton asks Mercy questions about the witches and where they meet. She tries to utter the witch's name, but her voice fails. Suddenly, she becomes rabid and deranged, jumping onto the ceiling and screaming like a banshee. The desperate Reverend brings a muzzled Mercy to the town square to finally identify the witch tormenting her. When Mercy is about to approach Mary, she manipulates the girl, who turns back around and runs on all fours toward Giles. She bites off the tip of her index finger and points it at the innocent man, convincing the townsfolk that he's a witch. On his way out of town, John Alden encounters Isaac, who stops him from leaving Salem at gunpoint. Meanwhile, in the Sibley home, Tituba prepares Mary to telepathically link with other witches for the Sabbath. She falls into a trance as the rite begins in the woods. In the forest, Isaac takes John to spy on a bizarre ritual, where they witness bodies emerge from a tar pit, surrounded by creatures wearing animal hides. However, the ritual gets interrupted when Isaac yelps at the sight of a lizard that has stitched eyes. The noise alerts the worshippers, and one who is wearing a pig's head catches John and Isaac, but John shoots at it so they can escape. In the bedroom, Mary wakes from the trance and realizes the circle has been broken. John and Isaac return to Salem only to see Giles pressed to death by heavy stones after not pleading guilty to being a witch. From her balcony, Mary sees John lashing out following his friend's unjust death. Seconds later, she closes the balcony doors and demands Hale tell her who it was that interrupted the ritual. The silver-haired man with a fresh wound on his ear insists he was unable to identify the infiltrator because of the muzzled flash, revealing that the magistrate was the witch wearing the pig's head. Furious, Mary declares her devious plan to use the witch trials to turn the Puritans against each other in order to complete the grand rite, the witch's most powerful and dangerous ritual. Following Giles' death, a drunk Cotton contemplates the witch hunt and begs God for a sign. Meanwhile, Isaac throws Giles' lifeless body to the crag, a large valley at the foot of a ravine in the Salem woods where the remains of outcasts like criminals and Indians are thrown. While Cotton lies with Gloriana, John bursts through the door and threatens him with a knife to the throat for permitting Giles' awful demise. When the Reverend says that hell is a fiery pit filled with black tar, John stops and thinks back to what he witnessed in the woods. John orders the Reverend to get dressed, and as they walk out, he recounts what they observed in the woods. Their conversation is interrupted by Hale, who arrests John on the spot for intimidating the select man earlier that evening. While attempting to escape his captors, John instructs the Reverend to find Isaac. Later that night, in the Sibley residence, Mary questions Hale about arresting John. The magistrate expresses his concern that John might cause problems, but she reminds him that John is her problem, not his. She orders him to consult the seer to find out who interrupted the ritual. Meanwhile, Cotton follows John's advice and tracks down Isaac, who takes him deep into the woods by a large tree. As Cotton looks at the twisted tree, he finds a deep hole on its trunk that he compares to a witch's cauldron. The reverend sticks his arm into the void and pulls out a severed human hand covered in strange markings. Cotton and Isaac watch as a lump moves underneath the skin. All of a sudden, a mass of crawling insects start to pour out of the hole in the middle of the palm. In jail, Mary frees John and convinces him to leave Salem, making it clear that she doesn't want him there. Shortly after, John takes his half of the silver coin and gives it to a beggar, a gesture that breaks Mary's heart to witness. The following day, an unmarried girl named Hannah goes into labor and is about to give birth with the help of Salem's trusted midwife, Bridget. Mary interrupts and urges the girl to reveal the name of the father. Hannah's pained cries from the contractions force Mary to remember her own agonizing experience the night she got rid of John's child. When she leaves, she runs into another pregnant girl named Kitty, who she eyes with suspicion as they pass each other. Meanwhile, Hale searches for the seer, and the blind man takes him to his cabin. The magistrate tells him that he needs to identify the people who broke their circle during the witch's Sabbath. The seer takes out the lizard with stitched eyes from the night of the ritual and promises he'll have the answers for the magistrate soon enough. At church, women gather around the strung-up Mercy hanging on a cross. Mercy's condition horrifies Bridget, who thinks that the selectmen are using it to incite a witch panic in Salem in an effort to exert control over its people. Mary warns the midwife to be careful with her words because people may perceive them wrongly. Later that evening, Mary finds herself sobbing while feeding her familiar. When Tituba walks in, she warns her that the milk might turn sour because of her tears, but Mary counters that she may have suckled more than a toad if her life turned out differently. Moments later, Mary says she's found another innocent life to sacrifice. She senses that the courtesan Kitty is carrying a lifeless, malformed baby, which she plans to use as proof of a monstrous birth to help manipulate the reverend who is desperate for answers. At the brothel, Mab and Gloriana join Kitty as she goes into labor. Bridget responds to the baby's cries, arrives, and tries to help turn the breech baby around. While Bridget presses on Kitty's belly, Mary creates an illusion, turning Bridget into an ugly hag in Kitty's eyes. Terrified, Kitty flees to the corner, but she falls on a floor and gives birth to a lifeless and deformed baby. Enraged to discover that Giles's body was dumped in the crag, John tells Isaac to help him recover the remains so he can bury them in the Salem cemetery. Meanwhile, Cotton pays a visit to Mary, who shows him the misshapen stillborn in a jar, convincing him that the monstrous birth is a sign of witch's existence. The following morning, Mary comforts a devastated Kitty, who reveals what she had seen the night before. Hours later, Bridget is arrested on charges of witchcraft. Anne begs her father to intervene in Bridget's trial, but he is helpless to prevent his daughter's friend's punishment. In the midst of Cotton's forceful interrogation, Hale tries to question his accusation of the trusted midwife who had been so helpful to the women of Salem. John then attempts to defend the accused by saying that the monstrous birth was coincidental and that everyone who was there should be tested. When Mary feels the crowd siding with John, she suggests using Mercy's judgment. She orders the women present during the birth to stand beneath Mercy's feet. Mercy shows no significant reaction to the three courtesans. However, when it is Bridget's turn, Mary concentrates on her spell to make Mercy spew blood on the midwife and spit nails on the floor. As a result, the majority is convinced that the midwife is a witch. As Bridget awaits her fate, she begs the Lord for the people to see her innocence. Following the midwife's death, John is shocked that Cotton is willing to take another innocent life in his pursuit. Anne is distraught and attacks Cotton out of anger, but the captain talks her down. Meanwhile, Hale questions Mary's choice of victims, and mentions how he witnessed his entire family burned at the stake and doesn't want the same fate for his own family, especially Anne. Mary then scoffs and describes how old world witches, such as Hale's family, were too scared to claim a new world. That night in the bar, Anne confronts John as to why he hasn't intervened to prevent the unjust killings of their friends. Later that night, John visits Mary and expresses his desire to stay in Salem, and informs her that he'll be taking his father's seat on the board of selectmen. After John leaves, Mary takes the doll, stuffs it with herbs, mouse blood, insects, and Anne's hair strands. In the middle of the night, as Anne is sitting on her bed sketching a portrait of John, her door opens, seemingly for no reason. Suddenly, Mary's strange doll appears on top of Anne's dresser.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.